Welcome to the Sixth Wheels Consulting Podcast, dialoguing disability and discussing difference, inclusion, and all abilities in today's world. Now here are your hosts, Matthew Shapiro and Bob Nolly.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Step right up, have a seat. There's one over there. No pushing, no shoving. There's room for everybody. How are you, everyone? Welcome to the Six Wheels Consulting Disability Podcast. This is your co-host, Bob Nolly, with my good friend and your host, Matthew Shapiro. Matthew, good day, sir. How are you?
I'm great, Bob. How are you, sir?
I'm doing good. I want to cheat.
Cheating
How many times does somebody step into your room in your life and just go, I want to cheat?
Yeah, cheating is allowed.
That's terrible. You and I have talked about a strategy to when we started doing this show. And I said, it should be evergreen. And what that means is people should be able to listen to it and appreciate the conversation and get involved in the issues without it being, tied to a certain time. And, you could stay away from that by, never talking about the weather or something, or never talking about the Redskins kicking somebody's rear end, just last weekend. So we try to cheat and make it evergreen. But today we can't do that because today is election day.
Yes.
And it's the midterm elections nationwide. Everybody's House seat is up for re-election. A good chunk of the Senate. And one way or another, at the end of the day, the people are going to send a message, period.
Yes.
So that's why I thought it would be a good idea for us to kind of like shuffle the deck and talk about how the issues might impact the election coming up. And there's a number here that I just had to swallow a bit harder when I heard it. And you already know it because you're so deeply involved in it. What percent of voters are touched by disabilities? Now, that doesn't mean they have one. That means somebody in their family has one, or they care for someone, or somehow they're touched by disabilities.
Sure.
You know that number? Have you socialized that number? What would you think that would be?
I think it's in the 70s somewhere. Is that right?
If you had told me, from a point of knowing this top to bottom and said it's over 70%, I would have said, no, I bet the hard under there. There's no way it's that high. Dude, you're right on it. It's 74% of voters are touched by disabilities.
Sure.
This is from a former U.S. representative and mayor of Dallas, Steve Bartlett. And he's the chairman of a group called Respectability, which is a Washington-based, nonpartisan, nonprofit group that fights stigmas and advances opportunities so people with disabilities can participate more fully in the community. So he says 74% is that number, and he was the primary author of the ADA in 1990.
Sure.
And behind that, he says the country was founded on the principle that anyone who works hard should be able to get ahead in life, and everyone deserves an opportunity to earn an income and achieve independence just like anyone else. Candidates for office ignore the disability community at their peril. So they can make the choice to do it, but the votes still count. According to the Census Bureau, more than another huge number, 56 million Americans live with some form of disability. This can include visible conditions such as spinal cord injuries, visual impairments, hearing loss, people with invisible disabilities such as learning disabilities and mental health and autism, and a whole string there. Particular note from his survey is that while there are certain issues historically on which people with disabilities feel more strongly than Americans without disabilities, like healthcare, sure, and employment opportunities, they track in a similar way to Americans overall when it comes to their political identity. So that's really important. So a recent poll of 1,000 voters showed that fully 34% are grouped as being swing voters, 36% as Democrat, and 29% as Republican. More than half of Americans with disabilities have reached out to their officials. Half have reached out to their officials or attended a rally in the recent past versus 39% of Americans without a disability.
And Bob, I'm to cut you off for 1 second. I am one of those people. I regularly attend, political events, both from my lobbying standpoint and, just wanting to be involved civically. And as our longtime listeners know, we recently did an episode solely on, accessibility of voting places. And so this conversation, on this episode is really a continuation of that with it being election day and we really wanted to continue that conversation around voting and elections.
And that is really telling the size of that body. When you go out and do your work on Capitol Hill, either the Capitol Hill here in Richmond or the Capitol Hill in Washington,
sure.
Do you sense not an enthusiasm, but a concern and embracing of the size of this community?
Well, I think it's always been a situation where candidates have never done a really good job of targeting the disability vote. And that's something we talked about on the previous episode, but I'll reiterate it again here. Candidates have never done a really good job to purposely target the disability vote. And with that big number that you're mentioning, 56 million Americans, that is 1 in every 5 is a person with a disability. So why our candidates don't do a better job of actively trying to seek that vote has always been a head scratcher for me, because that is a population that could clearly and distinctly put a lot of elections over the top, when a lot of elected officials only really try to go after your main minority groups, right? Like your African Americans, your LGBTQ population, your Hispanic population, your men, your women. The crazy thing is that disability covers all of those minority groups. And so why we have not, as a society, one, as we talked about in the previous episode about elections, made elections more inclusive and accessible, and 2, had candidates who have actively tried to target that population and that voting bloc, has always been a head scratcher to me.
So, I guess today being election day, it's a bit late for any candidates that are running, perhaps, to listen to us and act upon what we are saying. But do people with disabilities get their news, generally in the same places that the broader population does? They get their news from Fox News, 29%, then CBS, 21%, then ABC is 21%, NBC is 20%. That's pretty flat. Why does this add up to over 100%? It's because the question was, what are your 2 major sources of news? And then CNN is 19%. Here is a really telling question from this research. 35% of people with disabilities evaluated the year of 2018, this year now, as America having a bad year. Another 24% said, it was only a fair year. But additionally, 86% of Americans with disabilities want Congress to pursue change in 2019. And over half of them, 49%, want significant, bold change in the coming year. That's quite a message there.
Those numbers and those statements you're saying just make me want to weep, frankly. Weep with enjoyment, because how often on this podcast have we talked about, whether it's traveling or whether it's other issues that we've addressed on this podcast, how often have we talked about that there needs to be some sort of significant change around disability legislation? I have often argued that we need a second disability rights movement. And to me, those numbers that you just illustrated and just talked about prove that, right? Because the disability population is tired of waiting, and they are tired of, frankly, in a lot of situations, sort of being thought of as second-class citizens. And I hate to say that as somebody who is a person with a disability, but it's kind of the way that it is. And I think those numbers you just shared with the audience kind of bear that point out. If 80, I think you said, what was it, 86% of Americans want Congress to do something significant. So here's the double-edged sword, right? You've got your constituents saying that they want you to do something significant, but yet you don't target that constituency group as a potential voting bloc. So why is that, right? Why is there that disconnect between what the numbers are telling us and what actually happens during elections?
Looking backwards, I think the community got themselves in the right place because October, that we just turned the page from, was National Disability Employment Awareness Month.
Sure.
And Respectability was working with other groups out there to get America's workforce to empower everyone. Jennifer Laszlo Mizari, I apologize for that, Jennifer, if I mispronounce your name. Not only mispronounced, I'm sure I just clobbered it. She's the current Respectability president. She says people with disabilities bring unique characteristics and talents to the workplace. Well, that's not going on a limb at all. The impact of employees with disabilities is very well documented and include much higher retention rates. Hiring somebody new is expensive broadly in the disability community and without the disability community. Because if you make a poor hiring selection, that is very expensive.
Sure.
That is very expensive. And the retention that you get within the disability community is much higher than over the broader population. For example, last year, more than 343,000 people with disabilities entered the workforce. That's a four-fold increase over the year before.
Sure.
Four-fold in 1 year. And the Council of Economic Advisors says no group has felt the benefits of accelerated economic growth more than Americans with a disability. Well, I would say that's good, but I would also say that's about time.
It is, right? And I think that it all sort of ties together, right? We as a population need to be able to perform our civic duty. And by that, I mean we need to be able to vote. But then we also want a lot of the basic opportunities that our able-bodied brothers and sisters get, right? And so you can't do one without the other, right? And we can't have our voices be heard if we're not able to vote on election day, but we also don't know where our candidates stand, or in a lot of situations, we do know where our candidates stand. I talk about regularly. If I'm going to vote for a candidate, I want to know what that person's stance is on a lot of issues, and it's so interesting. I have a quick story for you, Bob. So I did in 2008. I was still involved with doing journalism before I got involved in my advocacy work. I thought I wanted to be a sports writer, and I did a summer program that was an intensive journalism summer camp. And our task was to write a newspaper. And we had to write stories on the 2008 presidential election, so the Obama-McCain race. And I decided to write my story on how the candidates were going to benefit and serve disabilities. And I called both candidate offices and I said, where does the candidate stand on, a number of disability issues, whether it's Medicaid, employment, housing, all of the things that people with disabilities are interested in. the Obama administration directed me to their 8-page website, 8-page section on their website that outlined all of their policies that they were going to implement to benefit people with disabilities. The McCain administration, on the other hand, however, when I called their office, they basically said, we don't have anything. We'll get back to you, and we'll provide you with some information.
Oh my!
They never got back to me, and I'm not telling that story to make it sound partisan, but in my opinion, it shouldn't be one group has something and the other group has nothing. People with disabilities are, if not the largest minority group that exists, one of the largest minority groups based on that 56 million Americans number that you shared earlier. And the fact that you have a major political party back in 2008 not really have some policies and procedures in place was interesting. And then fast forward to this last election, 2016, and at both the Democratic National Convention and the Republican National Convention, you had people with disabilities center stage talking about the importance of disability rights as a voting population. And that, to me, was the first time I ever saw both major political parties highlight and put forward people with disabilities as an important block of people that they were targeting. Now, does that need to continue? Obviously, yes, it does, based on what you shared with us a little bit earlier. I want to see candidates highlight people with disabilities in their commercials. I want to see people with disabilities running for office. There are not enough people with disabilities in public offices helping to shape
policy.
Helping to shape policy and being decision makers for not only the rest of their communities, but people with disabilities themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to give you the last word here, because as we sit here tonight and go through the returns, watch the returns come in here later in the day tonight, and what above anything else is the one thing you hope to see and hear as you follow this all tonight?
That is a really good question. I want to see our country come together. I think this is not a political statement. I'm guessing people maybe can figure out which way I lean at this point based on some of our conversations, but I don't like the divide that is in our country right now. And I think we need to get back to working together to solve problems. I don't care if you're a Democrat. I don't care if you're a Republican. I don't care if you're an independent. I don't care if you're the Green Party. I don't care about any of that. What I want to happen is I want us to stop. I want us to accomplish things. I feel like for the last 8 to 10 years, really, we have become a country that would rather obstruct than work together. And again, that's on both sides of the aisle. That's not one party over the other. That is both sides of the aisle not wanting to, dare I say, compromise. how much of a novel concept is that?
That would be great. That would be great, and I do indeed hope we hear that tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to this special Election Day edition of the Six Wheels Consulting Disability Podcast. On behalf of Matthew Shapiro and myself, Bob Nolly, think inclusion and keep rolling forward. We'll see you next time.